October 16, 1941, Moscow. A day that official chronicles for many decades tried to mention only in passing, or to pass over in silence entirely. The morning did not begin with the usual hum of factories or the ringing of trams, but with a frightening, unnatural silence. For the first time in its history, the doors of the Moscow metro did not open. The enormous underground artery, the heart of the capital, had stopped. Rumors, heavy and sticky like autumn mud, began to spread through the city. The metro was being prepared for destruction. The government had already left the Kremlin. German tanks had been seen in Khimki. Ash swirled over the city. Documents were being burned. Thousands, millions of pages, party lists, personal files, secret reports. Black snow made of paper fell onto the wet asphalt, and people felt as if it was the ashes of hope itself. It was a moment when history hung on a razor's edge. Chaos engulfed the streets. Trucks, packed to the brim with belongings and people, tried to break through to the east, creating traffic jams on Enthusiastov Highway. Some fled, saving their families. Some tried to evacuate factory equipment, and some took advantage of the moment of anarchy, looting stores. A sense of an end hung in the air. Not just the end of the city, but the end of an entire era. The collapse of a state that had seemed an unshakable monolith just yesterday. The irony of fate was that precisely at this moment, when panic reached its peak, the enemy was closest to triumph. But it was precisely this fear that became the fuel that later transformed into the fury of resistance. But to understand how the great city found itself on the brink of an abyss, and how it managed to hold on when gravity seemed to pull it down, we need to rewind time and look at the map, where red arrows had almost closed in around the heart of the Soviet Union. Operation Typhoon. The very name, chosen by the German command, sounded like a death sentence. A typhoon is an element that cannot be stopped. It sweeps away everything in its path. The plan was grand and simple in its cruel logic. A double encirclement, the destruction of the main forces of the Red Army in the pockets near Vyazma and Bryansk, and then a swift dash to Moscow. German generals, intoxicated by the successes of summer and early autumn, were already allocating apartments in Moscow and planning a parade on Red Square. Their confidence was not baseless. The Wehrmacht was the most perfect war machine of its time, a well-oiled mechanism grinding down the armies of Europe one by one. By early October, disasters seemed inevitable. The defense on the distant approaches had collapsed. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers were encircled near Vyazma. The road to Moscow, in essence, was open. Between the German tank wedges and the capital remained only a thin, broken line of hastily assembled cadets, militias, and remnants of shattered divisions. It is here, at this point of absolute military superiority on one side and desperate situation on the other, that a drama unfolds, extending far beyond strategy. This was a conflict not just of infantry and tanks, but a clash of two realities. The German reality lived by the laws of blitzkrieg, speed, onslaught, disorganization of the enemy. The Soviet reality in those days consisted of improvisation and self-sacrifice. When Guderian's and Hoth's tank groups broke through the front, champagne was already being poured at Hitler's headquarters. They considered the war won. Berlin newspapers came out with headlines stating that the fall of the Bolshevik capital was a matter of days, perhaps hours. However, an unforeseen force interfered with the flawless German plan, a force that the Wehrmacht strategists had considered merely an annoying hindrance, but not a strategic factor. Nature. In early October, the rains began. But these were not just autumn precipitations. It was the Rasputitsa, a phenomenon unfamiliar to European drivers. Russian roads turned into bottomless swamps. The vaunted German equipment, designed for high-speed marches on highways, began to get stuck. Trucks got bogged down to their axles, tanks skidded, consuming triple the fuel. The pace of the offensive, the main trump card of the Blitzkrieg, dropped from 40 kilometers per day to 4. Logistics began to crack at the seams. Ammunition, fuel, provisions, all of it got stuck somewhere in the rear, trapped in the mud. But it would be a mistake and a great oversimplification to attribute the enemy's delay solely to the mud. While German columns struggled with the roads, the Soviet command gained the most valuable resource: time. Those few days that the Wehrmacht lost in the mud allowed for reserves to be brought up. Not only professional soldiers but also divisions of the People's Militia rose to defend the capital. These were people of purely peaceful professions: teachers, engineers, workers, musicians. Many of them held a rifle for the first time in their lives. They went to their positions in their coats and caps, knowing that their chances of returning were extremely slim. Their task was simple and tragic: to stand to the death, gaining hours and minutes for the Siberian divisions to arrive. And they stood. Near Yukhnov, near Maloyaroslavets, on the Borodino field, where history seemed to loop, repeating the events of 1812. While divisions were being ground down on the fields near Moscow, within Moscow itself, its own, hidden from view but no less intense, conflict was unfolding. In the Kremlin, the fate not only of the city but of the entire country's governing system was being decided. Psychological tension reached its limit. In mid-October, the State Defense Committee passed a resolution on the evacuation of the capital. Foreign diplomats, part of government institutions, even Lenin's body, all were sent deep into the country, to Kuibyshev and Tyumen. The mining of factories, bridges, and even buildings in the city center was in full swing. Moscow was preparing to become a trap, ruins, but not a trophy. However, the main question remained open. Would Stalin leave? His departure would have been a signal to everyone. Moscow has fallen. This was understood in Berlin and in Moscow. Legend has it that the train was already steaming, the guard ready. But Stalin stayed. This decision, whether dictated by cold calculation or an irrational feeling, became a turning point in the psychological war. The rumor that the master is in the Kremlin had a greater effect on the panicking capital than any execution orders. Order began to be restored through harsh measures. Patrols were given the right to use weapons on the spot against looters and provocateurs. The city was turning into a fortress. Shop windows were boarded up with sandbags, and anti-tank obstacles and barricades grew on the streets. Women and teenagers dug anti-tank ditches on the outskirts, biting into the frozen ground. This was no longer just a population, it was a garrison. And Georgy Zhukov arrived at the front. A tough, strong-willed man, devoid of sentimentality. He took command of the Western Front at a time when, in essence, there was no front. There were only pockets of resistance. Zhukov managed to do the impossible. From the chaos of retreating units, he rewove a line of defense. He mercilessly demanded that they stand their ground, counterattack, and wear down the enemy. There was no room for doubt in his orders: save Moscow at all costs. And that cost was terrible. Losses were in the thousands daily. Entire regiments disappeared in the fire in a single day, but new ones rose to take their place. November brought with it the cold. The mud froze. German generals breathed a sigh of relief. Tanks could move again. The second stage of the offensive began, the final push. Berlin demanded that Moscow be taken before the onset of real winter. And again, it seemed impossible to hold them back. the Germans approached the Moscow-Volga Canal, occupied Klin, Solnechnogorsk, Istra. The distance to the Kremlin had shrunk to 20 or 30 kilometers. German officers could see the city's towers through their binoculars. They already felt the smell of victory, but along with it, they began to feel something else, a chilling cold penetrating their thin greatcoats. And here we come to one of the most paradoxical moments of this battle. On November 7th, with the enemy at the gates, a military parade was held on Red Square, a traditional parade in honor of the anniversary of the revolution. From a military logic perspective, this was madness. German aviation was based a few minutes' flight away. One well-aimed bomb could wipe out the entire leadership of the country. But the parade took place. The low, cloudy sky and snowfall covering Moscow became the best anti-aircraft defense, as if nature itself had decided to give the defenders a chance. Troops marched past the mausoleum and went directly to the front. The radio broadcast of Stalin's speech to the whole world came as a shock. The entire world, which had already mentally buried Moscow, heard, "The Soviet Union stands, the army exists, the spirit is not broken." This was a colossal ideological slap in the face to the Third Reich, and a powerful injection of adrenaline for the entire country. Meanwhile, on the front, the situation teetered on the brink of catastrophe. The Germans broke through in the Volokholamsk area. The legendary battle at Dubosekovo siding, which became the legend of the 28 Panfilov men, reflected the general picture of those days. A handful of people with grenades and Molotov cocktails against an armada of tanks. Regardless of historians' debates about the details, the essence remained unchanged. Infantry stopped steel wedges with their flesh and will. In these days, the phrase was born, quote, zero. This was not just a slogan, it was a physical sensation of one's back pressed against a wall. By early December, the German offensive began to run out of steam. The blitzkrieg mechanism, designed for a short summer campaign, collided with the reality of the Russian winter. The temperature dropped, -20, -30. Grease in weapons thickened, engines refused to start, synthetic rubber on truck tires crumbled from the frost. But the main thing was the people. German soldiers, dressed in light uniforms, without winter gear, suffered from frostbite. The army that conquered Europe turned into a crowd of people wrapped in women's scarves and rags, shivering by bonfires. The Wehrmacht lost its mobility and, more importantly, its self-confidence. At the same time, Soviet intelligence, thanks in part to Richard Sorge in Tokyo, definitively confirmed. Japan would not attack the USSR. It was preparing for war with the USA. This untied the hands of the Stavka, echelons stretched from the Far East in Siberia. Fresh, full-blooded divisions, Siberians, dressed in warm sheepskin coats, felt boots, armed with automatic weapons, accustomed to severe frosts. They unloaded from the wagons and immediately entered battle. For the exhausted, freezing Germans, the appearance of these fresh forces, as if grown out of the snow, was a psychological blow. They believed that the Red Army had no more reserves, that it was bled dry. This was a fatal mistake of German intelligence. On December 5th and 6th, 1941, something happened that would forever change the course of World War II. Soviet troops launched a counteroffensive. This was not a local counterattack. It was a blow of immense force along the entire front from Kalinin to Yelets. The German command was caught off guard. Accustomed only to advancing, the Wehrmacht generals did not know how to organize a retreat in winter conditions. The front wavered. For the first time, the invincible German army fled. Abandoning equipment, artillery, the wounded, they rolled back to the west. The roads along which they had so swiftly advanced to Moscow were now clogged with abandoned tanks and trucks, covered with snow. It was a graveyard of equipment and ambitions. Hitler, in hysterics, gave orders to, quote, removed generals from their posts, took command himself, but could no longer stop this process. The myth of the Wehrmacht's invincibility was dispelled in the snowy fields of the Moscow region. The world saw this machine could not only be stopped, it could be beaten. In the liberated cities and villages, Soviet soldiers saw the terrible traces of the new order. Burned houses, gallows, destroyed cultural monuments. In Leo Tolstoy's estate museum in Yasnaya Polyana, the Germans set up barracks, and upon retreating, tried to set fire to the house. In Istra, the New Jerusalem monastery, a masterpiece of 17th century architecture, was blown up. This barbaric cruelty, encountered by the liberators, finally shaped the character of this war. Now, it was not simply the defense of territory, it was a sacred revenge, a war for the annihilation of evil. The counteroffensive pushed the enemy 100 to 250 kilometers away from Moscow. The threat of the capital's capture was lifted, but the price of this victory was colossal. The fields of the Moscow region were strewn with bodies. The Red Army's losses in the battle for Moscow, including the defensive phase, amounted to almost 1 million people, irretrievable and sanitary. This is more than the combined losses of the Allies and Germans in many other major operations. Every kilometer of reclaimed land was paid for with blood. In a strategic sense, the battle for Moscow became the collapse of Operation Barbarossa's plan. The idea of a lightning war failed. Germany was forced into a protracted war of attrition, a war of resources, in which the Reich had no chance against the combined potential of the USSR, Great Britain, and, joining the war in December, the USA. Moscow became the first nail in the coffin of Nazism. It was here that the backbone of the German war machine was broken. The best personnel of the Wehrmacht, the elite of the army, officers and soldiers who had traversed all of Europe, remained lying in Russian soil. There was no one left to replace them. The quality of German infantry would never be the same again. However, analyzing the events of those days, one must not fall into oversimplification. The victory near Moscow was not predetermined. It was not a miracle descended from heaven. It was a sum of factors, monstrous mistakes and brilliant insights, cowardice and incredible heroism, cruelty and self-sacrifice. It was the victory of a system capable of mobilizing all resources, and the victory of a people who, despite all grievances and sufferings, did not accept foreign yoke. It was a moment of truth for every person, from private to general. The resonance of this battle is heard even today. It teaches us a lesson about the fragility of civilization and the strength of the human spirit. We often think that history moves according to a pre-written script, that good inevitably triumphs. But on October 16, 1941, there was no script. There was only chaos and the choice of each individual, to flee or to stay, to surrender or to fight. It was the sum of these millions of choices that created history. Today, walking through peaceful Moscow, descending into the metro that works like clockwork, it is difficult to imagine that silence and that ash. It is difficult to imagine the anti-tank hedgehogs on Leningradsky Prospect. But if you look closely, the scars of that battle are still here. They are in street names, in monuments, in family albums where photographs of grandfathers and great-grandfathers are missing. The battle for Moscow is a reminder of how close the world stood to the edge of the abyss. We return to the beginning of our story, to that very snow that fell on the shoulders of Muscovites, but now we see it differently. The snow that seemed like a shroud in October became an ally in December. Nature, people, and history intertwined into a single knot. Moscow stood not because it was an impregnable fortress of stone, but because it became a fortress of people. And when you next see newsreel footage from those years, soldiers in white camouflage suits attacking against a backdrop of snow-covered fields, remember not only the victory, remember that moment of complete silence and despair from which it all began. Remember that victory is born not to fanfare, but at a moment when it seems all is lost, yet you take one more step forward, a step towards the enemy, a step into immortality. This is not a story about generals and maps. This is a story about how the impossible became possible thanks to the will of millions. And this lesson, about the power of will in the face of absolute hopelessness, remains universal and eternal, beyond time and beyond borders. The Battle of Moscow ended not just with the retreat of the Germans. It ended with the birth of a new confidence. The enemy can be defeated. And this confidence, born in the snows near Moscow, would lead the Soviet soldier all the way to Berlin. But this path would still be very long and difficult, and its beginning was laid right here, on the threshold of their native home, which they did not surrender, did not give up, did not betray. The political and moral significance of this event cannot be overstated. The USSR's allies, watching the struggle with bated breath, received a signal. The Soviet Union would not fall in the coming weeks. This accelerated the creation of the anti-Hitler coalition. Lend-lease supplies, the opening of a second front in the future. All of this became possible because Moscow held out. If the capital had fallen, the geopolitical map of the world today would look completely different. Perhaps Japan would have entered the war against the USSR, and then a two-front war would have been a death sentence. Perhaps Turkey, having concentrated troops on the border with the Caucasus, would have decided to strike. Moscow was the keystone that held the arch of all global resistance to Nazism. Looking into the faces in old photographs, the faces of militiamen, nurses, pilots, we see not just participants in historical events, we see people who, with their lives and their fate, paid for our right to live. Their sacrifice was not in vain, but it was terrible. And the memory of this should not be a cheap parade picture. It must be honest, encompassing both the bitterness of the early war defeats and the panic of October and the inhuman strain of forces. Only such a memory, voluminous and truthful, has true value. Moscow in 1941 is a symbol that even in the darkest night, when all lights go out and hope seems like ashes, there is a force capable of igniting a light. This force lies in the unity and determination of people to protect what they love. And as long as this memory lives, so do those who remained in the snows of the Moscow region, shielding the heart of the country. Their silent feet resonates louder than any words, reminding us of the price of peace and the responsibility of each generation to preserve it. The history of the battle for Moscow is an open book, its pages written with courage and pain. And this book must be read with the heart, so as never to allow a repetition of those terrible chapters. The winter of '41 retreated, leaving behind ruins and graves, but also leaving faith. Faith that justice exists and is worth fighting for. The battle for Moscow became the first ray of the dawn of victory, which would come only 3.5 long, bloody years later. But it was here, at the walls of the ancient Kremlin, on the snow-covered fields and in the icy trenches, that the invaders' arrogance was broken and the unbreakable will of the people was affirmed. And this feat, majestic and tragic, will forever remain in the ages as an example of what a person is capable of for the sake of protecting their home and their future.